There is a term that's being used, which is the emphasis on facilitation in the new growth path. Partnership between government and business, consensus building. How do you understand all of those terms?
Well, I think that's quite important as one of the major pillars to determine whether we will or will not succeed. Because our point of departure must be, whether you speak as government, as business, or as labour, that we want an economy which is bigger, stronger, and above all, better, in the sense that everyone has access and many more jobs are going to be created. This is not going to be a task that can fall on the shoulders of the government alone, on the shoulders of business alone, or of labour. We're going to have to work together. And in that process, of course, we'll have to recognise that at the end of the day, as the new growth path document does indeed, recognise that the private sector really has to lead with job creation. And that means you have to create an environment within which the private sector feels confident and wants to move ahead.
Those who've looked at the various components of the new growth path within business have been very concerned about the so-called increased role of the state. Do you find it to be interventionist?
Well, look, we live in a mixed economy. There's a role for the government and the role for the private sector. What business has been saying is, we've got to make this mixed economy work better, stay away from some of the isms, socialism, capitalism, globalism. Only one ism, and that's pragmatism. And it's quite clear that there is a bigger role for the private sector to help with delivery, to make things happen. And we've got to find a formula, and one does exist through the public-private sector partnerships, which are not used on a sufficiently large scale in this country. They are instruments that can be used whereby you can mobilize the private sector to help government to deliver, because the big issue is not the theory of development, but it's practice and making it happen. And we see a lot in the new growth path that is really not new. We actually have to come back and say, we've been here before, we must now walk the talk and make it happen. And I think that's where we are, and I think government agrees with that.
Business has been very concerned about the proposal, and the minister insists it's a proposal on a cap on salaries for high income earners, and also a discussion about pricing in South Africa to make just basic goods a little more affordable for the everyday person.
Well, the whole issue of prices and wages is a, excuse me, a very controversial aspect of the new growth path, and quite clearly it will have to be debated. We've got to divide the new growth path into three components. What can we achieve in the long term? What can we achieve in the medium term? And what can we do in the short term? There we talk about low-hanging fruit. Some of the things we've been at before, we haven't done them well, we haven't implemented them. I don't think the wage restraint prices issue is an immediate issue. It will be debated. There may well be disagreement. The important point is, does the new growth path offer a potential, a platform from which to reach more consensus on what needs to be done, and above all, to get on with it?
What do you see consensus being in this environment where parts of the business community see this as too much regulation by the government, too much economic activity being dictated to by the government? Absolutely
clear from the business point of view that we need to lighten the regulatory framework. As the phrase goes, smart tape, not red tape. And this is particularly important for the small and emerging business person who finds himself tangled up in a lot of red tape to try and start a business, try and comply with all the requirements. And this is important because although the new growth path talks quite a lot about employment, we'd like to see a lot more emphasis on self-employment, not the average youth saying, where do I find a job? How can I start something myself, a business activity? We need to focus very heavily on that too. Self-employment and entrepreneurship, we need to create an environment for that, and the private sector also has a responsibility there.
This is my interpretation, and it could be wrong. Government needs to create jobs, 5 million within the next 10 years. Labour is talking about quality jobs. Business is talking about value for shareholders and skills within the context of the jobs that it's creating. But we're sitting with a massive unemployment problem, and government is saying, just get people active and working and earning some sort of a wage. Everything else will sort itself out.
Well, I think what business is saying is, of course, we want to have long-term quality jobs, decent work. We're committed to that. But quite clearly, in our circumstances, we have to apply and approach that in a flexible way. There are obviously serious challenges now, and as one government spokesman has said, it's degrading not to have a job.
Yeah.
Now, we're not talking about sweatshops. What we're saying is we've got to be flexible. We must accommodate the youth and all those workers who are already sending out a message. We don't mind earning a little less if we can keep our jobs. That is the flexibility we need, and I think there's a trade-off there, and we've got to find each other. I think labourers needs to be assured that it's not going to lead to exploitation. Business needs to be assured as employers they'll have the flexibility and the confidence to employ more people, and that's what you really want.
So within that context then, as people are making concessions, then would business be prepared to talk about this whole idea of salary caps? Earn a little less for high-end workers so that we can use those resources to get people in at entry level?
Well, I don't know that doing that's going to make too much difference. You need to have a different mindset altogether, looking across the labour market where the bulk of people are going to be employed and where you want to make sure that there's an employment-friendly environment. This has several components, and this is the basic message that business is bringing to this whole debate. We must proceed with the new growth path in such a way that at the end of the day, you have an employment-friendly environment in which both government and the private sector can work together to create the maximum number of jobs within a context of high growth.
Let's talk about greater private sector investment in the economy, because one of the concerns is that the jobs will have to come from government creating those jobs, and that invariably means a bloated budget for the government and a deficit ultimately. Post-recession, we've seen corporates wanting to sort of preserve cash, wanting to be leaner, more streamlined, and we're not seeing heightened investment on the part of the private sector. Now, it could just be because we're in a post-recessionary environment, but others would argue even when we were growing, the private sector was not at the forefront of creating jobs. We had growth by way of equity values going up, but we were not seeing jobs being created.
Well, that's not quite correct, because in the period 2005 to 2007, when we were growing at 5 to 6%, we managed to get unemployment down to, but still a very high level of 23%. Which did say to us that even when the business cycle is in your favor, you are unable to maximize the number of jobs. So even then we were debating under as BUSA and the previous programs, what are the constraints, the structural constraints. Now we're coming back to this, and that's really where we are with the new growth path. We're saying to ourselves, in the medium, short and long term, what are the issues we need to grapple with, and above all implement? What is some of the so-called low-hanging fruit, which we've been talking about for years? For example, artisans and apprenticeship, and tackling the education system, the skills gap. There's a lot of common ground, green jobs, small business. I know that someone will say, well, the amounts of money are not very great, but the fact is it's not being well invested. You want one-stop service for small business. There are a number of structures that purport to help them. These are all low-hanging fruit where you could make a difference. And as you breed some success, so hopefully you build trust. You can then begin to tackle some of the medium and longer-term, more difficult issues. Right. But that's where you've got to start, and the name of the game must be implementation.
Right. The proposal that the new growth path is putting an emphasis on labour-intensive jobs, particularly within the manufacturing sector, for instance, mining, agriculture. We've just had a criticism earlier on that, if you look at the cycle of the South African economy and where the drivers of growth are, it's now the services sector, it's the high skills areas of the economy. It doesn't make sense to be pushing a labour-intensive formula.
I think we've got to find the right balance. I think that's what it's all about. We can talk ourselves out of everything. We really have to now, we have to panel beat these proposals, see what will work, what won't. We want to be globally competitive. Once again, if you take the labor-intensive argument to its extreme, you could teach everyone to build a dam with a teaspoon, and then you'd create the maximum number of jobs. No one is proposing that. What I say, you have to have a balance between what you go on the labor-intensive side, and your ability ultimately to be globally competitive. Because if we want to grow, create jobs and develop, we're going to have to carve out a much bigger chunk of world trade and world investment for ourselves. So we've got to get the right mix, make the right choices, and try and mobilize as much support as we can from the key stakeholders behind those choices.
What's needed to create local demand firstly, but competitiveness internationally? And here we're going to the whole system of the exchange rate, for instance. Some are saying a strong currency hinders our ability to earn more on exports. Others are saying even if you do something to the currency, you're not producing enough to compete with the Chinas and Indias of this world, and then it goes to the structural problems. What's your view?
Well, the BUSA view, and I think the mainstream of business, is we support the stance that was taken by the Minister of Finance and by the Reserve Bank that where we can lean against the wind of an overvalued currency, we should do so. And you'll have seen statements made by the Reserve Bank as what they've done to be able to build reserves. We've relaxed exchange control, but it's quite clear that as a small open economy, there's a limit to what we can do. It's helpful that perhaps the Egyptians have helped us more than some of the things we've done. But we can't rely on that. The issue is, what is your policy for currency management? We've got to say there's a limit to what you can expect. Let's address the other issues that are making us uncompetitive. And that's very important. It comes back, it feeds back into the new growth path and some of the structural issues that we need to address if we want this country to grow more rapidly in the future, which it has the potential to do, create many more jobs, which it ought to do, and be able to alleviate poverty on a much greater scale by growing this economy and making it stronger and better.
What would you like to hear the President say in his State of the Nation address, firstly, and then subsequently we've got the budget and then the various ministers doing their budget votes, just in terms of these pressing issues of job creations in South Africa?
Well, the State of the Nation address and the budget are two key opportunities for government to reinforce its message, which will be largely based on the new growth path document, but will take, of course, cognizance of the fact that there are other stakeholders whose cooperation is needed in order to make it work and for it to be a success. I think that there will be a strong message coming through the State of the Nation address and in the budget speech to empower all of us in this economy to take it to the next level. And that's very important, because what counts here are indeed perceptions as to how we're managing our affairs. To what extent are we cooperating? Are we making the right choices? Are we following sensible and prudent policies appropriate to South Africa, which will get us to a much higher growth level? Because foreign direct investment will be attracted by the message that we want to grow more rapidly. And that's very important. Last year, I might mention that we were in a situation where we lost nearly 78% foreign direct investment. It was not a good year for whatever reasons. Now that's sending us a message. That's sending us a message that we need to respond in a way. We need to send out the signals using the new growth path, using the inputs from the key stakeholders to send out a message from government, from the private sector, from labor, that we really do want to get on the high growth path. We do want to create more jobs and come and be part of this action.